Thank you everyone who's joining us today. Welcome to the Center for Jewish History's Family History Today series of genealogy-themed public programs. My name is Moria Amit, and I'm the Senior Genealogy Librarian here at the Ackman and Ziff Family Genealogy Institute. The Center for Jewish History provides a collaborative home for 5 partner organizations that together form the largest archive in the US on the modern Jewish experience. The Center's Genealogy Institute provides access to a wealth of genealogical resources through its reference library, online databases, research guides, and our expert referrals to relevant materials in the collections of our 5 partner organizations. At the Institute, we strive to make family history accessible to researchers of all ages, abilities, and levels of experience, whether Jewish or non-Jewish. While the center remains closed, our genealogy librarians, myself included, are still working remotely and are eager to assist you with your research. You may continue to engage with us in a number of ways. First, through our weekly Genealogy Coffee Break webinars, which air on the Center for Jewish History's Facebook page every Tuesday at 3:30 p.m. Eastern Time. Through the free genealogy workshops that we are providing to community groups, from senior centers to synagogues to schools, other nonprofit organizations, and by emailing us your questions to GI, as in Genealogy Institute, at CJH, as in Center for Jewish History.org. We are also available for more intensive one-on-one Zoom consultations as needed. I hope you had the opportunity to see some of the announcements of our upcoming programs before I began speaking. To learn more about these or other future programs, you may join our email list or check out our program calendar at programs.cjh.org. I have a few quick technical notes before we get started. So you may have noticed that your microphones have been muted and the chat box is not available. To send us your questions and comments, we ask that you please use the Q&A box, which you should find on either the bottom or the right side of your screen. And please note that our guest speaker will be answering your questions during the dedicated Q&A period at the end of her discussion. And a quick disclaimer before I introduce today's speaker: this session is for informational purposes only. The Center for Jewish History is not endorsing any business or promoting legal services. So now on to the subject of today's program. Our esteemed speaker, I actually first met her when she came to give us a talk at Shereth Israel, and I'm delighted that she agreed to speak for us today. Her name is Rita Meir Yardim, and she's a Portugal-based lawyer who specializes in the path to Portuguese citizenship for Sephardic Jews. She holds a master's with distinction from Oxford University in international human rights law and studied law at Lisbon University. While Rita currently lives in Lisbon, she has lived all over the world, including in Los Angeles, Melbourne, New York, Sao Paulo, and London. She is fluent in Portuguese and English, decent at French and Spanish, and is trying hard to learn Hebrew. So with that, please join me in welcoming Rita. Thank you, Rita.
Thank you very much, Mariah. Welcome, everybody. Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you may be. I tend to start introducing this topic by explaining that this law was approved in 2015 in Portugal. A very similar law was approved in Spain, and the logic of this law was to grant Portuguese citizenship to those who can prove that they are descendants of Sephardic Jews. And this was conceived as an objective proof, if that is possible. So you don't need to be Jewish, you don't need to be an observant Jew, you need to be able to prove through what the law calls objective elements that you are descendant of Sephardic Jews. So this proof is produced through many different types of documents, ways, paths. It all depends on the family's history, the geographic diaspora that the family followed, and in most cases there are a few elements which they tend to be present, or they make the proof easier. Let me start by addressing a few examples of cases that I have encountered, and mostly connected to US-based persons. But my experience it constantly involves working with families that are currently settled in, for example, South Africa, families from Brazil, from London, the Netherlands, Israel, the various Arab countries along the Mediterranean basin, the Middle East. So every family has a different story, and that means that the way we prove these connections to a Sephardic Jewish community will be different. But if I may focus on US settled families, what I've seen is very, very useful is to trace back in a certain family to your ancestor that first set foot in the US. Of course, that will vary immensely for different types of families, but one piece of document which is very interesting to look for would be passenger manifests. For fairly recent arrivals in the US, passenger manifests would be a very interesting document to look for in order to determine where did your ancestor come from before settling in the US, who was he traveling with, from what port did he originate, and most of the passenger manifests that I've seen, they also would indicate the nationality of the person, of this immigrant, sometimes even the race in which Hebrew would appear, as far as I've seen. I don't know if that's true for all years in which these passenger manifests were produced. So when it comes to US-based families, I would always say, try to determine who was your most recent ancestor that settled in the US. We don't have to trace all your genealogy until the Iberian Peninsula-based person. And even if we do, it could well be Spain or Portugal. The Portuguese law does not distinguish whether you have a connection, your ancestor had a connection to Portugal or Spain. The concept is the concept of the Iberian Jew, and there was significant movement between those two borders. But even so, it's very rare that we need or are able to connect a family to a given person in the Iberian Peninsula, be it Portugal or Spain. So usually we trace the genealogy. It is important to go at least as far as your great-grandparents. I would say that's the minimum that we have needed in these last 5 years of experience with this law. It's the minimum that we need to document through official records. These official records could be birth certificates, death certificates, marriage certificates. They could be old passports, expired passports. For example, one of the geographies, which is not very common in this law, as far as applicants are concerned, but one of the geographies I have now encountered, and we've done the procedure with success, would be a US-based person whose grandfather or parents were born in Iran, for example. If we need to document with official records the father or the grandfather or the great-grandfather in a country such as Iran, we would be using old passports. We wouldn't be usually obtaining documents, documents about those persons that we would request to the competent entities. So we don't always need to use birth certificates, death certificates, marriage certificates. We can sometimes use old passports, old visas, and that would help us document the family tree at least as far as the great-grandfather. But every story or every family will require different types of elements, of proofs, of documents. One other, I think a significant amount of the persons I've been helping recently, their parents, their grandparents, they settled in the US and they came from, for example, from the island of Rhodes. Whenever we can connect a person to someone who came from Rhodes at a given period in history, and we know the history of Rhodes, we can sort of stop there. If we are able to connect a person to 1 or 2 generations back to a person who lived in the island of Rhodes, they would have an Italian passport most likely, and that document would be sufficient for us to establish the connection of a person to an ancestor in a well-known Sephardic community. The same could be said for places such as Izmir or Salonika. So they are well-known centers of very important Sephardic communities. And by connecting a person to usually a very recent ancestor which was born or lived in those places, we have sufficient evidence of a connection to a community, a Sephardic community of Portuguese origin. That's what the law says. We need to show that tradition of belonging. In certain cases, we don't have that type of element, but in certain cases, when we do have family members that still speak Ladino, these would be usually older family members, a grandmother, an aunt, someone who would currently still converse in Ladino. That is a very significant element that we can add. It's not a document, but it's an important element that the Portuguese law, enumerates as one of the possible ways of showing the connection to a Sephardic community. So a Ladino recording, we've had as well, in Israel, it's possible to have a test, someone to certify that a person speaks Ladino. But usually a recording is enough. It doesn't need to be the applicant, the person who is interested in citizenship doesn't need to speak Ladino. But if we can show that there is a family, it's a family language, that it is spoken by 1 or 2 members, but 1 is sufficient members of the family, then that is also a very interesting and very significant element of proving your Sephardism, if I may call it that. What we are trying to do is to prove that if a person is Jewish, that the person has a Sephardic heritage as opposed to an Ashkenazi one. But it is well possible that a person has no connections, present-day connections to Judaism, and the Portuguese law does not demand that as a requirement. It may make the proof a bit easier if you have a recent connection to a Jewish Sephardic congregation, but it's not an essential element. If that connection exists for the applicant or for the parents used to belong to a Sephardic congregation, then another element of proof, which is interesting, is a statement from that congregation that the person in question or their family is considered Sephardic by their community, explaining why. It is not a sufficient element, and it is not decisive, but it is an important document, an important statement that the entity that has the responsibility of certifying, of issuing the certificate for naturalization for this specific citizenship route, that entity, which is one of the 2 Jewish communities in Portugal, the Porto community or the Lisbon community, they will give considerable weight to a statement by a rabbi, a congregation, that this family is considered or known by the congregation for X number of years and considered of Sephardic heritage. As I explained, the first step in this procedure requires proving, either to the Lisbon or the Porto community, Jewish community of Portugal, that this person, the applicant, has a Sephardic heritage, either because the person is connected to a Sephardic congregation, a Jewish observant person, or because his or her ancestors were Sephardic Jews. And I will explain what the second stage of this procedure implies. But in this first level, first stage of the certification, it is the geographies, they can be as wide as the world of the Sephardic diaspora. There are very interesting connections also to the Caribbean places, islands mostly, where Sephardic Jews settled, where the Portuguese Jews mostly came to, very frequently via the Netherlands. Sometimes we need to engage a genealogist or an archivist in Amsterdam to look for a certain marriage certificate or birth certificate of an ancestor who was from Amsterdam or Rotterdam, but mostly Amsterdam. And those archives also, they help us immensely in establishing the connection of a person, of a given person, to a well-known Sephardic community, such as the Amsterdam community. In many cases, we have, the path would be from Portugal to Amsterdam and then to the various Caribbean nations, islands, where at a certain point significant Jewish communities of Portuguese origins were thriving. It could be Curacao, it could be St. Thomas, Jamaica, Kingston. It could be even in Suriname or in Venezuela, the Coro, old congregation, old community. So in many cases, we look for the path toward until we reach the most recent Sephardic community in history that we know the history of. So what's fascinating about this work is that I am a lawyer, so I'm not a genealogist, I'm not a historian, although I'm the daughter of a historian, which helps in at least developing a little bit of the instinct and the passion for historical research. But whenever I am not able, through my own limited means, to look for the documents which I believe are relevant, it is very important to identify a genealogist, a historian that specializes in the geography that we need more documents about. And I would just maybe finish with another note on the countries of North Africa. As you are well aware, there were many communities, very significant communities, and of Sephardic Jews throughout those countries: Morocco, Libya, Tunisia, Egypt. When we have a family whose ancestors were born there, lived there, and they then made Aliyah to Israel, one important document, because in most cases we wouldn't have access to the documents from Morocco or Libya or Tunisia or Egypt, and if there were family members that went to Israel, that made Aliyah to Israel, the population certificates from Israel are very important because they state the country of origin of the then immigrant, and they state the date of birth, the names of the parents, and the date in which they immigrated to Israel. So that's also an essential and very useful document to give us a sense of the origin, the geographic origin of a given family. Other geographies that I've worked with, but not so much for US-based persons, would be the Amazonian area of Brazil. There was a large number of Moroccan Jews of Iberian origin that during the rubber boom settled in the Amazon basin and thrived there. So the community of Manaus or Belém tends to have also very interesting family histories, and it's also very, very, there are very good documents to connect and to research in those communities. I will just maybe very quickly address this procedure. So everything I've spoken about has to do with requesting a certificate which is required for naturalization. So requesting the certificates to the Lisbon or the Porto community, and that's the stage in which we have to prove the Sephardic heritage of a given person. Once we are able to convince, to document, to demonstrate the Sephardic heritage of an applicant, we have the approval, we receive a certificate which on the back will contain the family line that we chose to document as far as we were able, that we needed to document. And this certificate is the certificate that will be the main element for the citizenship application. Then the citizenship application is produced to the Portuguese government, the Minister of Justice. It requires proving identity, making sure that the person who received the certificate is the same person who is applying. Identity theft and issues about identity are very, very sensitive in the European Union and in Portugal. But this second stage is fairly light on documents. We need original documents, duly legalized, but usually they are limited to a birth certificate duly legalized, and that how you legalize a document depends on the country that issued it. We need to prove that there are no, the person has no criminal records, so we would produce a history check or a police certificate for one or more countries, depends on the applicant, and a legalized copy of the passport as a proof of ID. This second stage of the procedure takes longer. It is more bureaucratic also, not just because the law has been very successful and the number of applicants has increased every month, we can say, but also because there are great cares in terms of determining an identity, determining criminal issues or the absence of the criminal issues, and reaching the final stage, which will be the approval of this request for citizenship by the Minister of Justice, followed by the production of the civil registry of a registry of the new certificate. And that's when we get to the more tangible stage of this procedure, in which the person is then able to request a passport in the Portuguese consulate closer to their area of residence. And I think that as an introduction, what I've covered here would be, I hope, sufficient to give you a brief overlook of the procedure. And I'm very happy to reply to any questions, any particular doubts that may help me complete my presentation.
Okay, thank you so much, Rita. That was a wonderful overview. We do already have several questions that have come in, so I'm happy to start you off with Joe DeLeon. He says that I've recently read that granting citizenship for Sephardim is more difficult now because the experience is that people are using it for access to the European Union rather than to actually live or do business in Portugal. Is that true?
It is not true, but that question comes from an actual development, recent development. This law was approved unanimously by the Portuguese Parliament as an objective recognition of a connection, that if the Inquisition, the expulsion of the Jews from Portugal hadn't happened, the descendants of those persons would be Portuguese these days. So it's a way of granting a right which was denied, which was severed, due to that historic period. There was never in the law, or I believe in the motivations, the requirement, the objective of making those new citizens, forcing them to live in Portugal. There is no residence requirement. There is no investment requirement. It is a very in a sense, it's an objective verification. If a person is a descendant of a Sephardic Jewish person, recent or more remote, they have the right to citizenship. Now, what happened was that very recently, during actually right in the middle of the pandemic, some members of the ruling party they decided that they wanted to propose amendments to the law, which would lead into demanding for example, a residence requirement. That led to a very, very intense discussion from all sectors of the Portuguese society and political parties. And it was decided that those requirements of residence before you can apply wouldn't make sense. That was not the logic of the law. That attempt to change the law was blocked by the Prime Minister of Portugal, from which party those voices suggesting the changes came, and it was decided the law would not be changed. There was in the air there's still the sense that the regulation of the law may be tweaked, changed in some way, but not in a sense of adding requirements such as residence. The law very clearly says objective proofs of a connection to a Sephardic community. And that means that we're talking about past connections. We're not talking about new connections you need to establish. That is my view, and that is the view of most of the persons who oppose this change. The change did not take effect. There was indeed this conversation that these applicants are more interested in European citizenship than in Portugal, in connecting to Portugal. And it was also mentioned that maybe we believe that it's because they want access to the US. They want visa-free travel in the US. Well, my experience working with so many US citizens is that that is not the single motivation. Of course, why would you want a second citizenship? It's a multiplicity of reasons, some sentimental, some practical, some pragmatical, some just for the fun of closing the circle, of connecting to your ancestors, honoring them, and some also because life changes and families very rightly think about the future of their children, their grandchildren. But all of that is very, it's in the subjective realm, and you can't regulate that by a law. So to answer the question, the law was not changed. It was very forced, there was a strong resistance to that change, which is good, which also means that the change is not likely to be significant if there is any tweak, any new regulation that may be approved.
Okay, that's very good to hear. Thank you. Another question is that I've heard come up a lot is about name lists. So are there any official lists of names that if your family name is on that list, it's some sort of proof of Sephardic ancestry?
No, it proves absolutely nothing. There is no official list. The preamble of the law enumerated a few names that would come that were more frequent, but that preamble was never, it's not part of the law. It was never taken very seriously. Of course, surnames alone would never get you approved, but surnames together with other elements of proof would reinforce those elements. For example, if you're talking about some very well-known surnames, for example, you mentioned Sherith Israel. We know the surnames of the founders of that very, very old congregation of the US. And if we can add, there's an element in which this person has a surname, and we can show that it's a surname that's been in the family for a few generations, and there's a connection to that congregation, of course it becomes significant, but not because of the name, just because the name reinforces the connection. In the Caribbean, there are various surnames of families, many of which then are repeated in New York, for example, and other US congregations. There are many surnames that when you start studying the history of a given, sometimes a given island, you realize that in the synagogue, I had an opportunity to visit the Curaçao, the synagogue in Curaçao, a beautiful sand-covered synagogue. And of course, by understanding the history of that congregation, you realize that some surnames, they are recurrent. So surnames alone would not be enough, together with other elements, with the wider history of the place of origin of the family. Yes, by all means.
Okay. There's lots of sort of procedural questions. So if someone is descended from multiple recent Sephardic ancestors, for example, 4 out of their 8 great-grandparents, and there's pretty similar documentation available for all of them, does it matter which particular line you pick to prove
No.
your Sephardic heritage?
If the documentation is available for all those 4 lines, just choose the one, or I would choose the one that I feel is more interesting. But if they are equally documented, it doesn't really matter. You should never present all 4 lines and document all 4 lines. You need to
just focus on one line?
Yes, you have to choose one. If you have plenty of Sephardic ancestors, you have to choose the one maybe closest to your heart or to your intuition. Just to make your life and the life of the Jewish community easier.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see. So just to clarify, Porto and Lisbon are the only 2 Jewish communities for which you can apply for this certificate. Is that correct?
Correct. When the law was approved, it was stated that the then 2 existing communities would be responsible for certifying. They were given that immense responsibility because their certificate is so crucial in turning someone into a citizen. So those were the 2 communities that the law had in mind, and they are still the only 2 communities that can certify a person.
Okay. This question has come up multiple times. What is the usefulness of DNA test results in showing Sephardic ancestry?
It is not useful for this procedure of certification.
Okay. So it's not given any weight whatsoever.
Any weight whatsoever, as far as I've seen. I've been working in this law since day 1 almost. I have never seen DNA being weighted, considered. For me, it's there are of course scientific reasons why it is not given any weight, but I haven't seen that it's useful in any way. So I would never add anything, even if it was so conclusive that the person has Sephardic DNA origin, heritage, however you may call it.
Okay, thank you. Okay, a few very nuts and bolts questions here. Can you give estimates of the timeline for the different stages of the process, and then how long the whole process takes?
It has become harder and harder to give an estimate, and for various reasons. A ballpark figure, I think, not to increase your expectations too much, although it could be lower. Look at this as roughly a 2-year journey. It could be a little more. The current situation has meant a little slowing down on the procedure, not as significant as you would think, and it's not as significant because there is no need of physical presence of the applicant. There is no need of an interview, so the restrictions of traveling that we are encountering these days do not have any weight. The procedures, the certification can take a few months, not many, but it could take a few months or a little less. The second stage, in which we have a certificate and we apply for citizenship, the average that I've calculated in my practice has been those 2 years I mentioned. In certain cases, we have faster procedures, and those have to do with the mechanics of the civil registry in Portugal. It used to be that all the applications were decided by the central Lisbon registry, and because of the number of applications has increased exponentially, not just this type of citizenship. All sorts of routes into Portuguese citizenship have benefited from a more inclusive law. And so the amount of work increased so much that the Lisbon Civil Registry is distributing some applications based on their decision. There's nothing you can do. And sometimes a smaller, more efficient or less busy civil registry somewhere in the country would be able to very quickly analyze your application. And in very, very rare cases, you would have 16, 15, 13 months, but that's the exception. More than 2.5 years, it's also exceptional. I would say that the average would be 2 years for the citizenship application plus whatever time is needed for the certification procedure. Sometimes the certification procedure is quicker, sometimes there are questions, there are doubts that the community may have, and that we need to look for the answers in the documents and to convince them that that person deserves the certificate.
So actually that leads me into the next question. So is there sort of a back and forth between the applicant and either the Lisbon and the Porto community?
Yes, there is.
Do you just submit it once and then they make their decision, or can they come back to you and ask for more documents?
They are very reasonable, and when they make a negative decision, what they do is they ask for more documents to prove this generation, or to solve any doubts about identity. Usually that's the stage in which we say, okay, we need to maybe contact a Dutch genealogist, or a Panamanian specialized or a Mexican specialized historian. It's when there are, in their understanding, weaker spots of the application. So it's very rare that we have an absolute no. There is, of course, it takes time, more time, but whenever there is a question, what I always try to do is to understand the doubt and try to find other ways of proving what in their view is not sufficiently proved. So back and forth in that sense, yes, there's a first decision and then it goes to the second analysis, they call it.
Okay. And do you have any sense of how many applicants there have been and how many have been granted citizenship?
Yes, the numbers change constantly.
Yeah.
The law, when the law was subject to discussion during the month of, I think it was May, so when there was this attempt to change the law, significantly limiting the possibility of successfully applying, the numbers that were conveyed, they tended to be, I think back then, so in May, it means that it has changed for sure and increased. There were then around a little less than 20,000 approved persons and a significant number of applications. Those applications were divided by countries. I'm not sure, is it possible that I distribute through you a list of those numbers by country? It's very interesting. So I would be able, I don't have it by heart here, but I have.
That's okay.
We'll see. Maybe you can distribute to the participants.
Okay, I can do that.
Conference, how many applicants from the US, from Panama, from London, all sorts of countries, and you can see the increase per year. Every single year there's an exponential increase. So there are growing numbers, that's for sure. But the applicants, although
do you have an idea of the proportion, like what percentage of applications are approved?
The proportion is, well, because the procedure has slowed down, that proportion is, I don't have a number now.
Okay.
But I'm able to distribute those numbers later. There haven't been many refusals.
Okay.
It's just that the completion of the procedures, because it has been slower and slower, you have less people coming out with an approval. Not because they were refused, but because it is taking longer and longer. So the refusals are, as far as I am aware, only for criminal record issues. If someone has a significant, serious criminal issue, there have been refusals, yes. The law does not say that the government has the obligation to approve you if you fulfill the objective criterion, meaning there is discretion. The law was drafted in a way that allows the Minister of Justice to consider with reasons. They need to explain why, that although you fulfill the objective requirements, I am not going to grant you citizenship. As far as I know, it has never happened except on the basis of criminal issues. So the applications and the procedures, you know, every single month we have several approvals, and I'm sure that nationally there are a significant number of procedures concluded successfully. So it's just that the rate of conclusion has slowed down because of the very significant amount of applications every single month.
And what is the rough cost for completion of the process?
It does depend. In terms of fixed costs, meaning the application fees from those two entities that need to be consulted, so either the two Jewish communities I spoke about or the government, the fees in those two stages, the certificate has an application fee of 500 euros for the first family member and 250 euros for subsequent family members. And the civil registry, so the government, has a fee of 250 euros per person. So those are, let's call them processing fees. Then the person also needs to take into consideration certified translation costs. It is not mandatory to translate the documents, but what we've seen is that depending on the civil servant who is analyzing the application, if the civil servant does not consider him or herself fluent in English or Spanish or French, of course not in Hebrew. Hebrew documents have to be translated, but English, French, Spanish, if the civil servant does not feel confident, they will ask you later on to produce a certified translation. So you have the option of presenting the documents with a certified translation or waiting for this to be requested, because it does depend on the person who is dealing with your request. The Jewish communities, documents in English, French, Spanish don't need to be translated. The Lisbon community requires translation from Hebrew. I'm not sure if Porto does the same. I would think so. The logic here is that all the archives in the Lisbon and the Porto community, they are subject to being checked by the government. So they are the keepers of all of the documentation and information. And at any given time, the government may want, I don't know if it happens, I don't think so, but it is possible that the government may want to check those archives. So I would think that it's important for those communities to keep those documents, if they are not in a language that most people speak, such as Hebrew, correctly translated. But for the first stage, there are no translation costs. For the second, there may be. In terms of the other cost, which would be the legal fees, that would depend on the lawyer. Each lawyer has their own cost structure, has their own understanding of what is a fair remuneration for experience, credentials, qualifications, commitments. So I think that varies a lot.
And is it required to hire a lawyer, or just very highly recommended? Sorry.
It's the first stage, so requesting the certificate. If you are a genealogy, passionate about genealogy, if you are completely, if you do this because you have the documentation available, or because you have looked and you were able to gather what you think are enough documents, it is always possible to apply for this certificate either to Porto or Lisbon communities, and to request it. You need to produce a well thought and organized application. You need to be able to pay their fee, which is done by wire transfer, and you need to be available for whatever questions they may have. And it is possible. It's a more it does depend on the person and how organized, how well documented, how much free time the person has, right? Yeah. The second stage, the citizenship application. The application citizenship law, it has to be either the person can apply on their own name and right, and they can approach the civil registry in Portuguese and draft the application in Portuguese and engage the conversation. There is no conversation. The communication is always in Portuguese. Either the person, him or herself, or a lawyer. Someone who is not a lawyer cannot legally carry out this work on a recurrent and professional way. It is not very common, but I've had cases in which someone hires someone who was not a lawyer, and in the middle of the procedure, the civil registry realizes that. So as a lawyer, I have to produce my number in the bar association in Portugal. So either the person, I think it's very difficult for someone who is not fluent in Portuguese to do this second stage. The first one, it is possible. I always prefer to do both stages because for me, it is very important to know the person I am helping become a citizen. It is fascinating to learn the story. For me, it's a journey that I'm always very grateful for, and I learn so much by reading about the history of a given country, family, period. So but it's absolutely possible, and sometimes it does happen that someone was able to get the certificate, and I just take over from there in the citizenship application, so that roughly 2 years worth of a journey until we are on the last stage, which is, here's your birth certificate. You are considered Portuguese from the moment you were approved, so you are issued what we call a birth certificate, but it's not retroactive to your date of birth. And that document, which is not an original, it's a document that you can receive in a PDF by email. It's the one that you take to the Portuguese consulate, or if you're able to travel to Portugal, you can also have your documents produced in Portugal, mainly the passport.
Okay, let's see. It's about children.
Mm-hmm.
So how does it work in terms of a family applying? Can a whole family apply? If there are children applying, or if there are 2 generations applying, does the second generation, the children have to be under 18 years old or something like that? How does that work?
Okay, so there are no family applications, technically speaking. When you request the certificate, there is some efficiency if several members of a family apply together. But it's possible that one family member, it doesn't need to be the oldest, one family member opens the path, and a few weeks, months later, the other family members also want to join in. That is possible. Family applications would be applications of a number of people that apply together for the certificate. Possible, some efficiency, some speed for the other family members, but not necessarily, but each one will be looked at on the basis of each person's documents. If you establish a Sephardic heritage connection for one family member, the other family members just need to prove their connection to that certified person. So there is a sense of a family application in that sense. The citizenship application there is no relevance that you apply with your father at the same time as your sibling, your daughter. Each application is considered completely independently. Each civil servant has no idea about who else applied in the same family. It may well be different civil servants looking at different applications. So in that sense, an approval of one does not mean the approval of another one. Children, that's a very important topic. And the children of persons who are certified, irrespective of their age, children can also obtain a certificate for naturalization. So it's possible that a minor applies together with the father, the mother, or later on, and a certificate will be produced for a minor. However, that certificate for naturalization through this Sephardic route can only be used when the minor reaches the age of 18. That is currently the state of the law. Some years ago, there was some information from members of the government that they were considering expanding. So irrespective of age, you could always naturalize as a Sephardic Jewish person, or through that route. That was never, it was never amended. The law still stands as for those over 18. So one option is for a minor to apply and obtain the certificate so that when that minor reaches 18, if the law by then still exists, as we currently know it, that minor can apply. There is another route into citizenship for a minor whose father or mother became a citizen. So while they're underage, if the minor creates additional connections to Portugal, then the minor can obtain citizenship through another route that has no connection to the Sephardic route, but which would be as the child of a naturalized citizen, which is a different section or article altogether of the law. Usually, and in my experience, the way that this subjective concept of effective connection to the Portuguese community that the minor needs to prove is only proven when the minor is resident in Portugal. Once the family, so it's a more relevant decision, right? You have to be, your life project has to imply moving to Portugal. The mother or the father, as a citizen, they can move to Portugal whenever they decide and bring all of their dependent children with them. And from that moment on, the child will be creating those connections that would allow the child to become a citizen, not as the descendant of a Sephardic Jew, but as a descendant of a citizen and as a minor with connections to Portugal.
Okay. Let's see. So once a person receives certification, but before they actually are approved for citizenship, do they have any sort of, can they get like resident status in Portugal, or would they have to just apply for a tourist visa or something like that, yes, or work visa?
So certification does not give you immigration rights.
Okay.
It has no relevance towards your residence status. So if you are certified and you want to move to Portugal, you have to request a residence permit through the immigration law. And while you're waiting for your citizenship to be granted, you would be a normal resident, normal immigrant, or if you just decide to be a tourist, of course, you are very free to come as a tourist, but it does not give you rights to residence. Only citizenship does.
Okay. Oh, this is probably applies to a number of people watching. So Sarah Margarita asks, so Sarah applied for the Spanish citizenship back when that was a viable option. She's wondering if she can use the same documentation, genealogical tree, etc., to apply for the Portuguese citizenship.
Yes, by all means. Okay. It does not mean if a person was certified, approved in Spain, it does not mean an automatic approval in Portugal. You have to state your case again. I would say that it's very likely. I've seen documentations which were documentation produced in Spain that were relevant in Portugal. That is for sure a good start. The genealogy report, it will be analyzed on its own merits, of course, but all those documents will for sure be a very good, very promising start, but with no guarantees that in Lisbon or Porto will approve someone who was approved or even is a citizen of Spain.
Okay. Let's see. Okay. I understand that the current law does not allow for transferring citizenship to future generations. Do you see that ever changing in the law?
The concept of transferring citizenship, if I understand it correctly, how it's being asked, would mean that if I am a citizen, my children automatically have that right, and my grandchildren. And as I explained, each application is considered on its own merits. So the fact that a mother was approved does not mean that a child of, who's over 18 would be approved. It is very likely. There's no reason to think that won't be the case. But each generation has to apply. Each generation don't have to wait for the preceding generation to be approved. So that's the flip side, the positive side of it, which means that the 20-year-old can apply, without having to wait for his mother or father or grandfather to be approved. They're all considered individuals with their own strengths of their own application is considered independently.
Okay. Another question about the law itself. How long do you see the law, what do you think about the permanence, the long-term permanence of the law?
It is so difficult to predict. When I look at the justice of this law, when I look at the way it is being applied and interpreted by the Jewish communities, I think it should last potentially forever. Portugal never looked at this as, let's open a window, whoever is in, and then we close it. That was never the intention, never the logic. The idea is that if an injustice was committed, you don't have a statute of limitations on that. It should go on as far as people are able to prove their connection to the Sephardic community and willing to and interested in connecting, reconnecting to Portugal. I see this, and given the consensus that existed when the law was approved, I see this law as being, it touches a very deep chord in the Portuguese politicians and the Portuguese society. I think it would be very difficult to scrap this law completely without a very, very, very strong reason, which I currently don't foresee. I prefer to believe that this is a law that needs to be possibly improved. We have 5 years of experience. There's for sure some lessons we can take from how do you prove this, but I really don't want to set a timeline for this law to end.
Yeah.
But it's not my call, of course.
Of course. But you don't see it in the current political climate.
I don't. And I think that this attempt to change the law was actually a great favor done to this law, because it elicited such a strong reaction from so many, pro and against. But in the end, there was common sense prevailed, and the sense that this is not a law to grant citizenship to persons professing a certain faith. This is not about that. In my view, it could never be. It is a question of looking at the past, assessing if the connections existed in the past. If they existed, we are going to reconnect someone to the present community of Portugal. I think that, in a sense, this attempt to change the law, I think it spread the knowledge about the law. Lots of people didn't know what this was, didn't really understand the concept. In a Portuguese society, you wouldn't have many persons knowing what a Sephardic Jewish person is, and I think it also gave those who were listening to the conversation more information about how significant the connections were between these communities spread throughout the world, and their idea of an Iberian past and golden age, in a sense. And I can't predict whether this balance is possible to change. I think that there are still very strong reasons to keep this law alive.
Have applicants whose ancestors lived in Eastern Europe successfully applied for citizenship?
It is not only for those places who used to belong to the Ottoman Empire. So if you would consider Bulgaria an Eastern European country, and you need to understand that there was a connection to the Ottoman Empire. Further afield in other regions.
So like Ukraine, Romania, not so much.
I don't have enough experience to say or knowledge. You would have to explain that against all odds, your ancestors from those regions were Sephardic. Of course, there would be smaller communities, I would imagine, in my ignorance about the history of those countries. But would you have documents to prove that? Very difficult. I think that it's a very.
It is extremely difficult, I can tell you.
As far as I hear from the story. But those pockets of Sephardis living in an Ashkenazi ocean, if you could prove that that connection to a different, a not so obvious culture in those regions.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I understand. Let's see. We've covered most of the questions, so there's a few more questions.
Covered spouses. Maybe when you asked me about children, I didn't address the question of spouses.
Oh, spouses, yeah.
I'm very interested in knowing whether they can gather the whole family in the same umbrella, and also because emotionally it's important to have the whole family on the same passport for various historical reasons. I understand that. So for spouses, they have one option. If after the Portuguese citizen, so the spouse who became a Portuguese citizen, if after that granting of citizenship, they have a son or a child, so after the person becomes a citizen, if they have a child, that child is, we can't say automatically, but almost automatically a Portuguese citizen. It's a very quick procedure because the child will have been born to a Portuguese citizen. So we apply through a different article, a different section of the law that says children of Portuguese citizens born abroad have the right to citizenship. In that situation in which the couple has a child after the granting of citizenship, the spouse then has what you can also say is almost a very sure guarantee. It's difficult to talk about guarantees, but it's also a very straightforward line into citizenship for the spouse. The spouse is not Sephardic, because if the spouse is, then it's usually faster for each one to apply through their own genealogy, right? Because they will reach the end more or less at the same time. But if not, then the spouse that has a common child who is Portuguese can become a citizen. If the citizen has a son who is over 18, so if the person has a son who is over 18, the father and the son, for example, if they both apply and they both become Portuguese, the spouse, if the spouse can say, I have a Portuguese husband and a Portuguese son or daughter, then also through that means the spouse can obtain citizenship. This is because the concept for citizenship by marriage also refers to connections to Portugal. And the law currently now, it's a recent, more or less recent development, says that one very relevant and sufficient connection is to say, I have a child who is Portuguese. Now we know that a child has to be born after the granting of citizenship to the spouse in question, or if the child is over 18, then the spouse after the child becomes Portuguese can also obtain citizenship. Last resort, if someone becomes a citizen and if they move to Portugal with the spouse applies again through marriage, but because after moving to Portugal, that spouse has created connections. So the concept of effective connections also works here. And lastly, the new law which was approved, the citizenship law, the changes to the citizenship law that didn't affect the Sephardic route, there is the possibility that marriages of over 6 years of age will also be considered sufficient. Oh. The reason why citizenship by marriage has some restrictions is that the law wants to avoid marriages of convenience. So that's why they create those additional requirements. So spouses have various possible routes into the same citizenship.
Okay, I have a few more questions about specific documents. For an application from the UK, is it necessary to obtain a certificate from Bevis Marks first? Or just to submit any documentation, yeah. Or do you just submit what documentation you have to Lisbon or Porto?
If you have a connection, if your ancestors had a connection to Bevis Marks, it helps. It is, even today I was dropping 2 applications in which that connection existed for the great-great-great-great-grandfather who was married in Bevis Marks. It is not essential, but it is a community that both the Lisbon and the Porto community considers as having a very good capability of research, very good archives. So if you have documentation, birth certificates, death certificates, or marriage certificates that connect you to a person from the UK And if that person from the UK has ancestors in Amsterdam, for example, you don't need a certificate from Bevis Marks because we can understand what the path was for this person from Amsterdam, London, and then wherever. So depends on the situation. It is not essential. It is not a document that you can live without it. It does help.
Okay. Similarly, applications to the Sephardic Brotherhood of America, is that something that's considered, is that weighted as
It is,
evidence?
my instinct, I would say it is weighted, yes. Any declaration that a Sephardic congregation, community can produce, attesting and explaining that this family is considered Sephardic by their community, in their community, and why, it is always relevant. It is not the one document that makes the difference. It is another piece of the puzzle, another element that strengthens that the rest of the documents. But it depends. When the certificates from Bevis Marks that I'm familiar with, they refer to actual documents in their archives.
Mm-hmm.
It's different.
Oh, the Sephardic Brotherhood, they also have the Sephardic Brotherhood of America, they also have an archive.
Oh, because the certificates I've seen from the Brotherhood, they usually don't refer to the actual document, of this date, archived in more or less this registry. So it could be that I don't know enough about, or I haven't seen enough of those certificates. Okay. The ones I've read are more general than that. But yes, in that case, for sure.
So on a similar line, what about documents like letters or diaries, etc., written in Ladino by someone's ancestors? How much is that weighted?
Yes, Ladino is always a very it has significant weight. So whatever way you can show that Ladino was a family language. Mm-hmm. So the concept that the law specifically states objective elements such as the family language, and we know that when they're referring to family language, we're talking about Ladino. We could be talking to the Haketia, which is the language which was spoken in Morocco, but mostly it's Ladino. Whatever documents we can show to prove, to document that the Ladino was spoken by the older generations or written. Of course, we have to establish, we don't have to establish, but if there's a diary, we need to be able, if I was making the application, I need to be convinced that it's an authentic diary page, that it was produced, not for the purpose of this law.
Yeah.
The same for family or books, family books or publications that the family has a few years back produced because it was the 100th anniversary of an important ancestor, or because someone decided to produce a family book. If those books were published before the law was approved, to be honest, usually it's more significant because it was something that the family carried out a tradition of belonging, and that's the operative concept here in the law. Does this family have a tradition of belonging to a Sephardic community of Portuguese or Iberian origin? To demonstrate a tradition of belonging, you can use all sorts of elements, which in a sense are very personal and subjective. How has this tradition been kept throughout the decades, centuries? So diaries and documents in Ladino. The same for ketubas. So. Mm-hmm. I'm not the expert, so I can't look at a marriage contract and see, does this have the traces of a Sephardic rite marriage contract, ketubah? But whenever I have a question, I would ask a rabbi, does this look like someone whose family followed by tradition the Sephardic rite, or could it be an Ashkenazi couple? So usually, again, I am very ignorant about the details. That would be able to distinguish those two types of documents, but personal documents such as that they could be relevant if they produce those extra elements of the puzzle we're trying to piece together.
Yeah. All right, this is on a similar line to a question I asked earlier about surnames. But if the surname is also the name of an existing town in Portugal, does that have any relevance?
No,
No.
unless a very credible and professional genealogist could produce a genealogy report that connected through documents, credible sources, a person to that person that lived in a given town. Of course, we know surnames would, they can have a relationship to the place of origin, right? We know that. We know that in the communities, for example, in Turkey during the Ottoman days, many Sephardic communities, sometimes they organized according to their town of provenance. It could well be an interesting element, but I feel it's very difficult, except for one country, in Brazilians, the genealogists that focus in Brazilian conversos, so the descendants of the new Christians or the conversos, they are, in many cases, I've also seen genealogy reports for US-based persons, but the more frequent genealogy reports that I see that connect a person these days to someone who was tried by the Inquisition or was interrogated, or there's documentation that shows exactly the person that came from Portugal. Those are exceptions, I would say. Exceptions mostly in terms of geographies, because all other countries, archives were lost, documents, fires, earthquakes, wars. It so happens that in Brazil, apart from humidity and insects, there is a wealth of documentation up to a certain period, and beyond that, there are old genealogists that have seen primary sources, so it is possible also to trust their reports. But usually, surnames connecting to a town, I would say they are a curiosity in an application. They would never be a determinant factor.
Okay. So then just a couple of wrap-up questions. First, somebody asked, is the recording going to be made available? And the answer to that is yes. We will have a recording available within a few weeks, let's say. And it will be on our website, so you can go to either on cgh.org or on our YouTube channel. It'll be there as well. So, do you have a handout that you would like to share with the participants? Rita?
No, I think that the best course of action would be, my email is, I think, available or can be made available. I'm always very happy.
Can you tell everyone your email now?
So 3ws.mayerjardim, that's MAYER JARDIM, M as in mother, .com. Sorry, that is my website. It's a bit late in Portugal now. So my email is rita.jardim. So Jardim written as JARDIM @mayerjardim.com. That's MAYERJARDIM.com. Rita.jardim @mayerjardim.com.
Okay.
That is correct.
Thank you. Yeah, so I think that people should feel free to get in touch with Rita, excuse me, if you have any follow-up questions. And with that, I think we will say goodnight to Rita, because I know it's quite late there, and I really appreciate you staying up late with us. And thank you so much for really laying out the process of applying for Portuguese citizenship for Sephardic Jews. I think people really got a great sense of what the whole process is like, and especially more nitty-gritty details about what is necessary to prove your Sephardic heritage. So thank you so much for that. And
thank you, Mariah. Thank you, everybody, for
yes, thank you everybody for watching tonight.
And I hope to be in New York soon, maybe next year,
and
to deliver a presentation.
We definitely hope that you will come back and visit us in New York when we're open again.
I'm counting the days.
Okay. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.